particularly those of you who may come from downtown out to Waltham. To all of our students who are here for extra credit, well, we thank you too. I want to, by way of introduction, I want to introduce our speakers and really why we put this evening together. I'll start with Aaron first. Obviously, Aaron needs no introduction to most of you. He's professor of management and professor of psychology here at Bentley, and his teaching and his scholarship are devoted to the application of psychology to management. And I think one of the things we'll hear tonight is two really insightful views of psychology as it applied in a real-world situation. For those of you who don't know Aaron, Aaron has won every single award the school could possibly give for teaching. It's a list too long to mention. And he has a recent book, which we'll have later at the reception, called The Good Enough Manager, Making of a GEM, Making of a Gem. And I think many of us saw and really enjoyed your piece in Harvard Business Review some months ago on this topic. And the format will be a discussion between Aaron and Barry Werth, who's our visitor tonight, and I'm tremendously honored to meet Barry. I realized I had the first edition of The Billion-Dollar Molecule, which I must have read when I started my first biotech company, and we all dreamed of growing up to be Josh Boger, and we thought if we followed the book, we'd know how to do it. Barry is an award-winning journalist and historian, best known for his book, The Billion-Dollar Molecule, which chronicled the founding of Vertex, which is what we'll be talking about. And this is a book that's been named Fortune magazine's one of their 75 smartest books we know, and a Business Week top 10 book of the year. His most recent book is Antidote, published earlier this year, which now follows up Vertex 20 years later. It's really been 20 years, as Vertex has become the, I think today the market cap is about $28 billion, far cry from having a Series A venture round. I'm just as interested in Barry. Barry writes on a lot of topics. Barry's written a book called Banquet of Delmonicos, which looks at the emergence of social Darwinism, or more properly Spencerianism, in this country during the Gilded Age. A fascinating book called The Scarlet Professor, which chronicles the story of Professor Newton Arvin at Smith College, who was actually arrested and run out of Smith in the early 1960s for his sexual orientation and his community, as well as a fascinating book called Damages, which looks at the experience of a child in a family where the child was born with cerebral palsy, and looks at the legal systems assigning blame and liability. And this is a book that, just as I use Billion-Dollar Molecule in my MBA courses, Damages is used in many law schools studying torts and things like that. So before turning the stage over, I'm just going to share with you two quotes from some of the reviews of these books. A reviewer of Aaron's book, Good Enough Manager, wrote that the book went to the heart of managerial practice, shows how the manager-leader is able to create trust, facilitate in a facilitating environment crucial for success in contemporary organizations. Fortune magazine wrote about the Billion-Dollar Molecule that he offers deep insights into the difficulties of drug discovery, the trials and tribulations of startups, and the conflict between great science and good business. And all of you know that conflict is dear to my heart and the work we do here. And most recently, a review of the Antidote wrote, it's a book about predicaments encountered by just about any company whose future depends on constant innovation. So we have a pretty small vision tonight. Managerial practice, great science, good business, constant innovation. Let's see where you guys can take this. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'll begin welcoming on behalf of people here, since I've been here probably the longest of anybody in this room. If anybody's been here longer than 35 years, please raise your hand. Good. Okay. We got that settled. I want to officially welcome you, Barry, to Bentley. I look forward to a conversation with you, and really enjoyed this incredible narrative that you created. this amazing company, and about I was very intrigued by it because every time I was reading it along, and certainly I was intrigued somewhat by the science, even though I didn't know a lot about without a real scientific background, not knowing a lot about the science, but trying to learn about this idea of discovery. But I really got from my background, I just got so amazed at this personality of Josh Boger. As a human being. First of all, there's just some background that I discovered. One of the first things that just jumped right out to me is that he and I are the same age, and we grew up in North Carolina 20 miles apart, and actually went to competing high schools. I probably marched in the band at his high school during a football game, and obviously I don't think either one of us were football players during that time. And see, he goes off and forms this billion-dollar company, and somehow I ended up in Waltham, Massachusetts. So it's very interesting. We had similar, similar backgrounds and similar patterns. And just south of Charlotte, North Carolina, Ben Bernanke was growing up also. So as you can see, many good things come from that area of North Carolina and South Carolina. So, but anyway, Barry, if you could. I would just like to begin just having you, since this is such a compelling narrative, both books. I mean, one, obviously the billion-dollar molecule documents the founding and the startup and all the trials and tribulations of creating a company like that, all the way, to the point where, it went public and all the trials and tribulations around that. Just tell the story, if you would, how you got into this, how you just jumped into this narrative so that ended up in being, at least first, the billion-dollar molecule.
Okay. First of all, thank you all. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and I appreciate you coming out tonight. I hope this will be rewarding for you. I'm going to wind it back to a little bit before the beginning. Excuse me. In 1987, I went to work for a magazine called New England Monthly, which was started by an editor from New York, a guy named Dan Okrent, and was a wonderful journalistic showcase for a number of writers. The first writer at the magazine was John Harr, who went on to leave and write a civil action. Tracy Kidder, who wrote A Soul of a New Machine, worked there for some period of time. And I had the good fortune to start writing about the business of biomedical research. Somebody had come into the magazine and said that they had heard a story about some controversy at Harvard over some AIDS research, and they asked me if I would investigate it. I knew nothing about science at the time, I mean, literally nothing about science at the time, knew barely any more about business. And I had the opportunity between '87 and '89 to write a number of stories about how biomedical research was conducted. And I hoped that I would be able to get in someplace and actually watch it unfold. Now, from a journalistic standpoint, that's a very risky, open-ended kind of commitment. Any of you who know anything about science, those of you who are practicing scientists yourself, know that you can't schedule discoveries, you can't count on anything happening over a period of time except a great deal of enormous frustration. And I approached a number of companies, Genetics Institute, a couple of others, and they turned me away at the door. No drug company ordinarily would have any interest in having somebody like me hang around. But what happened was I had tried also to get into some academic labs, and just routinely the academic researchers that I spoke with had the same answer for me, which is, couldn't possibly let you see what we actually do. We've got doctor-patient confidentiality. If I'm teaching at Harvard Medical School or one of the other medical schools, I've got teacher-student confidentiality. I've got confidentiality with the external funders, the strategical allies that I have. I wouldn't be able to show you anything. And I kept approaching these people. And then in the summer of 1989, I approached one of them, and he said, well, I couldn't possibly let you see what we do here. But I just got asked to be on the scientific advisory board of a brand new company starting in Cambridge. They've just got their capital to start building out their labs. Maybe you should go see the guy. He's a very interesting guy. His name is Josh Boger. He came from Merck. And I live in Western Massachusetts. I called Josh. He said, sure, come on in. We'll spend the afternoon. We'll talk. And I drove into Cambridge, and I got to 40 Alston Street, which was a 10,000 square foot former construction company garage. I went inside. There are a couple of people here who were there then who will remember this. It was a construction pit. There were crates stacked to the ceiling. There were people with jackhammers carving trenches in the floor so that they could lay the pipe for the labs. There were a half dozen or so scientists. Josh used to say at the time, you know, I can get the entire scientific staff into my Volvo wagon. And it was really, I think, my very good fortune to A, walk into a place where things were very promising and likely to happen, and B, walk in at a time when the principal scientist and president and leader of the company was very receptive to the idea of getting some attention. So I got a commitment from Josh to spend a period of time during the fall of 1989 hanging around so that I could write a magazine piece, which was 6,000 words. It was titled The Quest for the Perfect Drug. It ran in New England Monthly in early 1988. In the back of my mind, I was always thinking, this is a tiny little sliver of what I actually need to see if I'm going to be able to tell the story about how these companies operate. I need to get in for a longer period. And that was not so easy. Josh had the authority to let me in for the magazine story, but he said to me, if you're going to hang around here for as long as it's going to take to write a book, you're going to need to get approval from the board of directors. And that was really where the heavy lifting began. I had to convince 7 or 8 venture capitalists, San Diego, Boston, and New York, that it was a good idea to have me, somebody like me, hanging around during the startup phase of what was, for them, considered to be an extremely promising but totally unproven young company. The last one I went to see was a guy who was at Greylock Ventures. I can't remember his name now, but he had an office on the top of one of the bank buildings downstairs. No, not Benno. No, Benno was okay. Benno Schmidt was right away. No, it was Dan Gregory. Dan Gregory. He's an old, staid Yankee guy. And I was sure that this was where I was going to get shot down. But I made my pitch, and he finally said to me, just stay out of their way. So even before the laboratories were operating, I was inside Vertex, just watching as things would unfold. I got a book contract based on that commitment. And then I said to myself, what have you done? Josh told me when I first approached him about this, I said, if I were to be able to hang around here for some period of time, say a year, year and a half, 2 years tops, what would I see? And he said, well, we'll have the labs up and running, and hopefully we'll have a lead compound, that is, you know, just a lead, really, on our inaugural program, which was an immunosuppression, and hopefully we will have made a $1 million research deal with another company which will, as Josh said, benedict us. It will show that somebody believes in what we're doing enough to put some money up. So these were not, if I was thinking rationally, I would have realized that's not very much. You know, I had no sense for the rhythms of science, the rhythms of the business of science. I had no idea how long things took. I just got excited. I got excited by him. I got excited by the scientists. I thought, if I can just stay here long enough, I might really see how things work. So that was really the origin of it. And then, you know, we can talk more about what it was like actually being around. But that's how I got myself in. And to this day, I think, how fortunate for me, A, to get in anywhere, and then B, to get into a company that really, you know, might be the real thing.
I mean, that's a rare occurrence. I mean, even if you're writing a case or anything like
Sure.
that, just to be able to get access to you know, to that kind of data and live in there. I got very intrigued, obviously, with Boger from the very beginning, as you know, and obviously from my background, from the psychology background. You know, I started kind of psychoanalyzing him as I was reading about him, and I just wondered, what was it like? What was he like? And I know Fred, I know you've met him and spent some time with him, and He just seemed to be such a compelling character.
I couldn't agree more. You know, I realized if I was going to write a book that I needed a central character who was going to be able to carry the book. And not everybody could do that. Josh is, I think, an extremely rare individual because he's got, I should give you a little background. He left Merck when Merck was the most admired corporation in America year after year after year after year and had vaunted laboratories because he thought he and the people that he would bring with him could do better on their own starting from scratch. So audacious out of the gate. But it didn't stop there because from the beginning he said, we will be able to do things here that nobody else can do. And some of the scientific advisory board members who were at that time all Harvard faculty members said to him, you know, well, what about Glaxo? And he said, Glaxo can't do it. What about Merck? Merck can't do it. So he had, from the beginning, huge expectations, just enormous expectations, but matched with a very, I thought, impressive degree of confidence, other people might call it arrogance, about his ability and the scientist's ability to actually make this very hard goal possible, and that's what you don't often find. I mean, there are plenty of people who can talk a good game, who have grand ideas, but Josh has also a practicality about him where he believed that he could, and he had no reason, I think, to assume that this was going to happen, but he was absolutely convinced not only that he had the right idea, but that he could make it happen. And I think that's what, for me, has made him distinct over these years. It's the connection between those two things.
May I share a quote with you?
Sure.
That you wrote. So
well,
I thought you might like it.
Yeah. Knock yourself out.
Right. In the Antidote, you had something that I just sort of zeroed in on about his leadership. It's a rather lengthy quote, so forgive me, but I think it really kind of captures exactly what you're talking about. It said, Boger forever kept one eye on the horizon, his optimism bottomless. He both dared and enabled others to think beyond their usual ideas and capabilities. He possessed what collaborators said of Apple Computer co-founder and recently returned CEO, when you wrote the book, Steve Jobs, a reality distortion field. I kind of like that term, a reality distortion field, a rich talent for convincing himself and other people through a mix of bravado, hyperbole, charisma, marketing, and tenacity that almost anything can be done. He brought other people around to his way of thinking, not through willfulness or manipulation, staring through others coldly if need be, but by unshakable faith in himself. I've never made a bad decision, he liked to say. I've just had bad data, which I think is fascinating.
That's him. You know, I mean, and you know, he made that case again and again and again. I mean, probably to the point where he was, you know, where it irritated the people who worked for him. But Josh has a philosophy that you really, if you have all the data, you can't make a bad decision. And he has, you know, I think that was in a way very liberating for the original scientists because it gave them the opportunity to think beyond their normal expectations.
Because I write about something called a facilitating environment, you know, and for scientists, especially if, you know, people in a very, very high level thinkers that need this combination, this freedom to do what they do, but at the same time somebody kind of watching over them and hurting them, you know, in some ways. And I was kind of fascinated by just how he did that. Well,
you know, so much has been written about how you motivate a group of people to innovate. And I think number one, you need to leave them alone and give them the freedom to fail again and again and again until they come up with a better approach. I imagine when you've got your initial investors, then Wall Street breathing down your neck, knowing that your horizons are going to be measured in decades, that's a very hard position to maintain. I mean, and I know that it was very difficult initially for people to believe that they were going to be able to last as long as they were going to have to last in order to push a product out the door. But his sort of relentless enthusiasm and optimism about what was possible gave people the freedom to do that. And that's not easy. I mean, you know, you can talk more about this than I can. How do you manage people? How do you get them to do something that they, you know, is not at all clear that they can do when it's going to take, you know, literally billions of dollars and tens of years to accomplish?
I mean, I saw him, and again, I have not had the opportunity and the pleasure of meeting him, but I was taken by the fact that he really kind of, in some ways, wanted to create this utopian kind of organization, this social experiment that, you know, sort of a totally flat organization, you know, where there's really...
Well, that lasted not very long.
I know. So the dream, but I was sort of taken with the idea that he had this sort of utopian vision, which a lot of people like him do, with, you know, a lot of, you know, of entrepreneurs, a lot of people who really see themselves and have what was known as the big, what is it called, the big fat hairy idea, whatever.
Oh, that's
the Jim...
BHAG.
Yeah, the BHAG.
Big, hairy, audacious
goal. Yeah, that was it, yeah. I just wondered if you could just tell some stories or tell some, give some examples, you know, for the benefit of people who haven't had the opportunity to read the book.
Well, let me go back to the beginning for those of you who aren't that familiar with the story. Traditionally, pharmaceutical drugs have been discovered through microbial screening. That is, you take a bunch of microorganisms and you cook them up in a fermentation bath and you begin to isolate chemicals out of there, and then you test the chemicals against biological targets, first in cells, then in tissue in animals, and then eventually, if you're on track to develop a drug that will be consumed by humans, you have to test it in humans as well. Josh's idea from the beginning, which was something that he and other scientists were working on at Merck, was that with enough information about the actual atom-by-atom interaction of a compound and a target molecule, you can actually figure out how to improve your compounds based on this physical data. What that meant was, in practicality, getting the target. Drugs are molecules. They interact with target proteins in the body, and how they affect us depends on that interaction. If you can isolate the target protein and then solve its structure through a biophysical methodology and actually then see how the molecule and the target interact, you can design better drugs literally atom by atom. So this was the theory behind Vertex. Josh had tried to do this, put together a team at Merck, and found that he just couldn't get his hands on all of the resources, and that's why he left. So he started his own company with the idea that they were going to do structure-based drug design. This was regarded by a lot of people in the industry as pie in the sky, beyond anything that anybody was capable of doing at the time. I remember Josh frequently would say then, people would say to him, yes, it's a very good idea, but isn't this 5 years too early? And he would turn around and say, yes, but 5 years from now it'll be 5 years too late. So he was, you know, he had this kind of unquenchable belief that it was time to do it and it could be done, and if you put the right people and resources together, you could make it happen. So, you know, that was, again, an extremely audacious, distant goal, but he hired people who believed, as he did, that this was also possible, and he gave them the time and the space to try to work out these problems. And even from the beginning, I stayed at Vertex in 1989 and 1990. I went home to write the book in the latter part of 90 and 91, and then I went back in late 92 just to see how things were going. And even by then, they had made some very substantial gains. They hadn't designed any drugs, but they had solved numerous protein structures. They had put in place a system that they could begin to establish this feedback loop, which was to look at the structure, design a molecule, bind it to the target, look at it again, see if there was change in activity, and through this iterative process, try to improve these molecules to the point that they would really be exceptional drugs. So even within the first 4 years, they demonstrated that that was likely to be possible. The problem was that 4 years is, you know, a fraction of what it takes to actually bring a drug to market. So I got to see, even though I felt like I had, you know, spent a good chunk of my life there, I got to see a very small part of the actual process. And that's what led me to decide to try to go back in 15 years later and write a second book about it.
And I was also taken by just how hard these guys, I mean, everybody he assembled around him was a high-achieving, incredible scientist.
Yes.
And also, in some cases, you know, quite, we got clashing egos, we've got competition, we've got, you know, I'm trying to, you know, equate it with, you know, some of the stuff that we see at a much lower level among faculty here, just in any discipline, really. If anybody's ever been to a faculty meeting, I highly encourage you to see one of those, or a committee meeting, just, you know, to see what happens. But you know, and the crazy hours and just people literally just working themselves into a frenzy. The emotion. I guess when I teach emotional intelligence, and I'm trying to see if the emotions that you usually don't associate emotions in science, you know, and just to see how. You know, what the drama was in all of this, and just the emotions that were stirred up around this.
Well, science is a toweringly frustrating business. It's failure is the norm. Success are all very hard fought and exceptional. So to be a scientist, I think, from the get-go, you have to be somebody who's very committed to trying something again and again and again and again and again and again until you get it right. So there was an inherent passion in all of the people who were working there at the time. Beyond that, they were burning through their capital and under enormous financial pressure to try to produce something. I mean, within biotech, there are these stages. You know, if you can demonstrate that you've got a molecule that's active in cells, you can take that to a potential partner or to other investors, depending on how you're being financed, and say, we've gotten this far. But there are so many hurdles along the way. I mean, in my second book, I wrote about the Vertex's hepatitis C drug, which was finally approved in 2011. That project started in 1993. I was there when they began that. And again, they went through this initial process of trying to isolate the target, and trying to solve the structure of it, and then trying to get this feedback loop working so that they could actually begin to design better molecules. But that was just the beginning. Then you've got to go through, you know, endless animal testing, toxicity evaluations, you know, just to get up to the point where you can finally present to the FDA enough data that they will allow you to test your drug in humans. It's a very long, very arduous process. Most people who work in the drug industry never work on a project that succeeds. They spend their entire careers working on projects that go down in flames. But there's this passion among people who work in this industry because I think they believe that it's possible with enough diligence and enough understanding to really produce important new drugs. They continue to be committed. So yes, there was fractious, tense, round-the-clock, chaotic kind of environment during those first couple of years. On one level, it was all very well thought out. Everybody understood that this is what it's going to take to do this. We're really going to have to scrap and make do with very limited resources against other organizations that are far better endowed and have products coming in so that there's a financial cushion. I mean, it was against all odds, and everybody knew that from the beginning. So I have nothing but admiration for the people who work in these companies. I'm kind of astonished that anybody's got that level of determination about anything, really.
I was rather taken by the episode that, and he's in fierce competition, and I want you to comment a bit because he has a rival. Mm-hmm. You know, this back and forth between the two of them with Stuart Schreiber. You know, they worked together for a while and then they split. And I mean, that's a drama, you know, or at least a side story in and of itself, which I'd like you to go into a little bit.
Okay.
But then there was this, and I remember reading this, and this is really where this really took on the a character of a novel in many ways, which, as it has been described, of this narrative where we have the young scientist. I think he was at Yamashita, who was really struggling and working. You here?
No.
No.
He's remembered.
He's remembered. Okay, so maybe other people can comment on this, but around getting a paper published in the journal Nature, you know, and dealing with the deadlines and getting an initial rejection. And I'm thinking about this as, you know, somebody who submits articles to journals from time to time, and my colleagues who do that. And then Boger sort of imposing his will on this incredibly prestigious journal to basically say, change your way that you're responding to it. And then it just felt like this scientist was going to just burst into flames himself. I mean, it just seemed like that he was on the verge of burning out. And so here we have Josh Boger pushing really, really hard, and in many ways changing reality, you know, just imposing his will on reality of the scientific process, and at the same time containing this person who is working so hard on this to try to get this piece published, you know, in a competition, it seems like, to get, you know, to be the first over the finish line, you know, and working around the clock and burning himself out. And that to me, that was just a particularly gripping episode of, you know.
It was a gripping episode.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm seeing some knowing faces here, so maybe I'm stepping on territory. That,
No.
Yeah.
I'll try to set the scene. It's a little hard because there were a lot of things going on, as there always were. But Vertex's first project was to go after a target called FK506 binding protein, FKBP for short. Okay, FK506 was an immunosuppressive drug that was developed by a Japanese company, and the scientists at Vertex were trying to, again, isolate the target, solve the structure of the target, and then figure out how to make better molecules that would bind more effectively to the target. And so, but solving the target was a big prize. It was a very hot target at the time, and there was a group at Merck that was pursuing it. There was a group at Vertex that was two groups at Vertex that were pursuing it by different technologies. And then there was Stuart Schreiber, who was at Harvard, who was initially on the scientific advisory board at Vertex. But Boger, and in particular his chief business guy, Rich Aldrich, believed, correctly I think, that Schreiber was not discreet enough about what he was learning inside Vertex and was actually sharing privileged proprietary information with some of their competitors. So they threw him off the board. But they were still in competition to solve this structure. And if I remember, I may be slightly off on the dates, but I think the company was also in the process of going public at about the same time.
This was just around that same time.
So there were numerous restrictions about what kinds of information they could release and couldn't release, but if Vertex could solve this structure ahead of anybody else, it was going to be an enormous boon for them. They were going to be able to use this information as they went public and say, effectively, we're in the lead here, we've got the target protein, we're in a position to develop the next great drug for this target. But it all was happening in this very compressed period of time under enormous pressure. I think of, there was a speculative bubble, and a lot of companies were going out at the same time, and it was like NASDAQ meets NASCAR. It was kind of wild. And this one young scientist who was under enormous pressure to try to solve the structure and get this paper into Nature in time for them to use it so that they could use it during their initial public offering, finally, at one point, smashed one of these chairs in the lunchroom and screamed at everybody, "You will all be stricken down." And he was serious, because to try to do good science in that kind of very fast-paced, highly pressurized environment meant that corners needed to be cut. And for a scientific idealist, that was beyond the pale. And this young scientist eventually ended up leaving the company and going to medical school. But the point that you made about Josh and Nature is that there was this pressure to get the information out and to make it appear as if there was a tie. Shriver and his group had solved the structure through one methodology and had a paper accepted by Science. Vertex submitted their paper to Nature, which is Science's chief
and these are
rival. These are the top.
Journals.
These are the top journals.
Right.
If you, for major scientific, Watson and Crick solved the structure of DNA, and they announced it in Nature. So this is where you go when you've got something very important to report. And there were these constraints about what could be said because of the IPO, and finally, Nature said, we're not going to review this now. And Bogert basically wrote them a letter saying, you must do this. It is of the utmost scientific importance. The world is waiting for this. And I remember sitting in the office with him, and he said, he was about to fax it, and he said, I've just taken out all the you twits, and I'm going to send it now. And he got Nature to turn around and break its embargo, and so that Vertex could report that it was in a tie, so that Vertex could be able to raise more money at its initial public offering, which viewed from one perspective is, this is just a company working in its own interest to take advantage of a discovery that it's made in order to raise money. Viewed from another perspective, it's like this is what drives science ahead. The opportunity to do this made these people work 24 hours a day, day in, day out, for literally weeks on end until they got this paper published in Nature. So, I went through a kind of a transformation while I was hanging out there. I initially thought, is this the best way for us to move things ahead? And even though it was, the demands were excruciating and the toll on the psychology of some of the people was very, very rough, I could see this is how things get pushed ahead. It's this level of intensity and competition that enables scientists to make these breakthrough discoveries. These things don't get done without that level of passion and commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just intrigued just with the idea, and I'm not being a scientist in that way, but just how someone could actually just change the review procedures of a prestigious journal like that. Just convince them to just...
Well, what he did is he said, he said, in effect, you're going to be second, we'll be second, but you also will be second. If you're at all, you
won't be able to have the opportunity.
If you care as much as I think that you care about your competition with science, it behooves you to give us a chance to do this because we'll both be looking good. So it was part of it was just political skill.
Yeah, but I was just amazed by that, by that particular episode. You mentioned the IPO, and I think for the benefit of a lot of business students around here too, to look at more of the business side as well. Could you comment on just the way they want to, as they move towards the IPO and then the inevitable? This is, I think, where we see the conflict between true science and scientific discovery and business interests, which I think is also another theme that runs through sort of the early book.
It was wild. This was the first half of 1991. The economy was in recession, and biotech companies were having a very, very difficult time raising any money at all. And then three things happened, two or three. One is the Gulf War, and there was a sudden kind of feeling of a resurgence of patriotism. It was a time when there was a sense nationally that we knew how to do things. But the other thing that happened that was much more crucial is that Amgen won a decade-long patent fight with Genetics Institute over the rights to produce and sell EPO, erythropoietin, which is it's a genetically engineered factor that helps in red blood cell production, and it's a drug that's given to people with anemia. It is still, to this day, an enormously effective and profitable drug, and it's the drug that the federal government spends more on than any other drug that it buys, because it's given to lots of cancer patients whose red blood cells get depleted from their treatments. In any case, Amgen won this patent case after all these years, and its stock went up 900% in about, literally 900% in about 18 months. And suddenly, the world, i.e. Wall Street, was entranced by the opportunity to invest in younger and younger biotech companies. So Vertex, which at that time was 2 years old and had practically nothing, had the opportunity to go public. Now, you know, generally speaking, before that, you would have to have something in phase 2, maybe 3 clinical trials to be able to convince underwriters that you could actually sell stock to the public. This is a company that was decades away from making any money, literally decades away from money. But there was so much enthusiasm for these young biotech stocks that Vertex got to go out. And it all happened in a very compressed period. They talked to a number of underwriters. They got one of them to commit to a plan to take the company public. And it all had to happen really fast because the window was only going to remain open for a certain amount of time. And as I say, it was wild. It was just, everybody was crazed. Had to be, because there was no other way to get through this period. And not necessarily what you would recommend for deciding, you know, whether a company should actually be able to sell shares to the public. But that's how it worked.
No, it was amazing to me. Could you? I'm just wondering if you could comment a bit just on this, because you were there, and the way scientists reacted to. I mean, in terms of because they were not overly pleased about this.
It was brutal for them.
Yeah.
You know, they were under extreme demands to produce. You know, when, again, as I said earlier, you know, it's a very hard business. Most of the time you're going to fail. The things that you're doing are immensely challenging. And now you have to do it under the gun, too, you know, because the investment guys need to be able to say to Wall Street, we've got something here. It just added another level of pressure that I think made it very, very hard for the scientists to work. But they did it.
So if we fast forward into, you know, you take this startup and then it moves into, and it grows, and then it moves into being a large company. So you revisit it 20 years later. What do you see? I mean, it's like leaving a small town, this little bustling town, and then all of a sudden you turn and it's a metropolis. So,
yeah, it was like that. Well, I'll try to fill in.
And also the formality of the organization itself, the fact that now, you know, it's no longer a social experiment. Now it's a fully functioning corporation, right, with all the things that come with that.
So the first book came out in 1994, and then Vertex and I went our separate ways. I would occasionally go back and see Josh and some of the scientists. The company grew enormously. It now has 5 research sites, not just the Cambridge site. And then in 2010, I was paying enough attention to know what was going on, but in 2010, it was pretty clear that they were going to be launching a blockbuster drug in 2011, this drug for hepatitis C. Better yet, they were going to be coming out in competition directly with Merck, which satisfied a lot of itches for them. You know, again, they'd started out saying we can do it better than Merck, so here it was practically 20 years later, and they were going to have the opportunity to prove that. So in the interim, Josh was ousted as CEO. I can go into that if you want.
Yeah, that would probably be good.
But he retired in 2009, but in fact, this was engineered by the board. They decided heading into this launch that they needed a more established commercial leader because the organization wasn't really fully developed yet. They hadn't put their commercial team in place, and the board was very anxious about this. But Josh stayed on the board of directors, and I knew that. So I took him out for lunch, and I said, listen, what do you think the chances are of me going back inside? He said, oh, I don't think that's going to happen at all. The environment now is so litigious. There are 50 attorneys generals in the states, plus the people at the Justice Department who are just looking for pharmaceutical companies to slip up so that they can have what he called settlements, that is, settle or I'll put you out of business. So, and then there were the class action lawsuits and all of the many legal threats against the drug industry that we've seen evolve over recent years. He said, I don't think there is a chance that they're going to let you back in. They're just way too sensitive on this stuff now. But I'll put you in touch with my brother Ken. Ken was Josh's older brother and was back during the billion-dollar molecule period the company's chief outside counsel. Subsequently, he became the general counsel for the corporation, and he was there. And I approached Ken, and Ken said, I think we can do this. He had to convince the new CEO, the then CEO, Matt Emmons, and probably as importantly, the corporate communications people, that it was possible to have somebody like me hang around and not have to deal with the perception internally and externally that the place leaked like a sieve. Okay, they were very, very concerned about confidentiality. That was the only real concession that I had to make to them, which is that I would show them the manuscript and they could review it for proprietary disclosures. But in any case, Josh was wrong, fortunately, and I managed to navigate my way in the beginning of 2011, a couple of months before they launched in CVEC, which did turn out to be a blockbuster. And you're right, it was a very different environment. Initially, when I started going, I would have to wait at the security desk for somebody to come and fetch me and bring me inside, and then swoop me down a hallway to some place where we could talk. And I was frustrated, frankly, because I was accustomed to having this access from my previous experience where I could go practically anywhere and talk to practically anybody at any time. Now I was being supervised and managed and handled, and I was worried about that. As it turned out, that all ended after about a 3-month period. I think once people saw what I was up to and realized that tabloid was not my style, they opened up to me. Eventually I had a security badge, I had a parking pass, I had a cube in the biophysics area so that I had a place to hang my hat and a phone to work with, and then over the next year I spent probably 3 days a week inside the company during the launch of Incivek, and also as they were planning to launch their second drug, which was for cystic fibrosis, which in a way is a much, much more interesting story. But it was a secondary story in the book because it was, I was there primarily to watch the launch and the marketing battle with Merck in hepatitis C. So very different place, but in its bones, very similar, I thought. Same kinds of very committed, passionate, exciting people working very hard in pursuit of something that was extremely hard to do. That hadn't changed.
So that core culture.
I think, let's talk about this. Yeah. I was reading an article this morning in the Times about Uber. And apparently Uber has pissed off a lot of people because of their arrogance and because of the way, the thing that actually caused the most recent flap is that their CEO said that they were actually going to investigate journalists who were investigating them in order to get some of these people to back off. In any case, I read a quote which I hadn't seen before, but it's probably familiar to you and a lot of you people, which is that it's a favorite quote in Silicon Valley, and it is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what it means is that the values and the vision of the people who work inside the company matter way more than any sort of strategic plan that you may have. It's really how people think, what matters to them, what they care about, how they function together. And Josh, about, I don't know, 13, 14 years in, when Vertex was still losing a lot of money, but looked like it was going to be able to produce real breakthrough drugs, instituted something that he called the Vertex vision process. He hired a guy named Bink Garrison. Bink was an advertising guy and an executive consultant, and he actually brought him in and put him on the executive team and gave him the title Senior Vice President and Catalyst. And Bink's job was to take what had been the Vertex culture from the beginning, very high aspirations, very smart, very determined, and try to codify it in a way so that that culture got reinforced and built into the organization in such a way that it would survive his leaving and well into the future. And it's interesting, I had numerous discussions with him when I was interviewing him for the second book, and he said that the thing that he was proudest of, and I imagine he's proud of a lot, is that he, through this process, this Vertex vision process, he got it instituted so that if you showed, as an employee, showed the right values, the right attitude, the right approach, the right passion, you could get your highest rating and therefore your biggest raise and bonus, even if your science was not successful.
Right.
So it was rewarding people for taking risks, rewarding people for the way that they collaborated and the way that they met challenges, as much as whether they met those challenges, and tying that to compensation. This is the thing that he was proudest about in the years that he was at Vertex.
Right. I'm cognizant of the fact that we've got just a little bit of time left, and I do want to open this to some question and answer while people are here. But I just wanted, in just bringing this to a close, there's a quote here from Bink Garrison about the culture and saying how absolutely important that was. He said, the thing that Josh understands is it's about the people. So he would do things that most guys don't do. He would have lunch with every new employee. You know, just as the owner of the company. He said you have to put the energy into the reason for the being of the company instead of putting the energy into the financial performance of the company. Josh built the culture. He paid attention to the culture. He was fascinated with the culture. It's the culture, stupid. That's the difference between great companies and not great companies. This is Bink Garrison commenting on that.
Well, I can't speak for Vertex today. I don't really know whether the culture has survived to the extent that it had when I was there in 2011, 2012. But you know, a lot of the, interestingly, you know, when I finally got back in, there were quite a number of what Josh would call the torchbearers, which were people who had started out with him in 1989 and who were still there. And I think they communicated that same degree of intensity and passion, and it filtered down. You know, I mean, I would meet young scientists, and they seemed to me to have the same kind of belief in what they were doing that the very early adopters had. And I don't know, you know. It took 20 years to get to the point where Vertex started to turn a regular profit, which they did for 3 or 4 quarters, and then they went back into the red because their blockbuster hepatitis C drug got displaced by another blockbuster hepatitis C drug. But the point is, in biotech, unlike practically any other industry I can think of, it takes that long to just get to profitability. This is not like you know, an app that you design in your dorm room and 6 months later you've got $1 billion company. This is a very, very long, hard slog. I think of it as, you know, like building a cathedral or something. It's like the people who start are not going to be the people who finish. So if they don't share the same vision, it's never going to get done. So it's very important in a company with those kinds of timelines to instill a culture that will last. And up until 2011, 2012, they had done that. As I say, you know, I haven't been back inside the company in a couple of years. I don't really know what's going on today. I can't speak for what's happening in the labs. Right. But at least through that initial period, they had sustained that original ideal.
So I have to end with something that certainly intrigued me. You know, given the where I saw that our books intersected, actually, and I didn't anticipate that that was going to happen. This is from the billion-dollar molecule after a particularly tempestuous time, and they finally got through this. And Boger, and it's interesting that you highlight some things that I highlight in my book about the so-called good enough managers, and especially they're building in structures and processes and organizations that allow enough autonomy, freedom, but at the same time can contain the chaos and can contain the craziness and the inevitable emotions. And so your quote is, like a catamaran righting itself after a spill in rough seas, Vertex quickly resumed its course in fleetness. Within days, Navia and Yamashita, who were this was their an episode there, began closing in on a structure that, if not perfect, was, in Boger's careful phrase, good enough. Good enough to satisfy nature and the crystallographic community. Good enough to draw attention away from Schreiber and tantalize Wall Street. Most important, good enough to begin to design drugs. And then it goes on to say, so he really had this kind of good enough philosophy.
I think it was a combination of a scientific and a business concept. I mean, particularly in terms of solving the structures of these target proteins, it was a very high premium on precision. I mean, you're talking about trying to identify where an atom sits in relation to another atom, and very hard, very demanding work, but not entirely necessary for what Vertex was up to, which was not to solve a perfect structure, but to make a drug. And in order to move things along fast enough and to try to help people with disease, Josh, I think, landed on this notion of good enough. This will serve us well enough to do what we need to do. It may not be perfect. And I think, again, with a process that's going to take that long and cost that much, you just cannot become obsessed with perfection. You have to decide that something is good enough to enable you to move to the next step. And, that became a part of their model.
It's really fascinating. I want to allow, this has been great, we can talk another half hour, but I want to open this up to people who have some questions, and then obviously there's some food involved in this too, so I know some people might be getting hungry out there as well. So Fred, I'll turn it back over to you.
Incredible. So the rest of the evening, our visitors and our faculty are invited next door, which way? That way we're going to have reception and continue the discussion. We have a number of people who were part of the original Vertex company here, and we'd love to ask you maybe at the reception to tell us a little bit about what you remember and what we can learn from you. I'd really particularly like to open the floor at the moment to some of our students. Not to diss anyone else here, but if any of the students would like to add some questions, because I know we're approaching finals next week, and they're going to disappear very rapidly. Any questions you'd like to ask Barry?
Yes, sir.
Yes. My name is Stephen A. Montalban. I'm a part-time MBA student here. My question to you is, can you comment on how do you think Josh's science background and his understanding of the business environment at the time help him to balance investors' interests in the science that the company was producing without being biased? And, in other words, how he kept the company alive at the time?
Well, science, as I've observed, is largely about obtaining data. Okay, data, and there's a whole, unfortunately, there's a lot of controversy today about what constitutes real data. But I think Josh had a very, very healthy respect for real data. So he was willing, and the scientists, I think, were willing to go to great lengths to get real information that they could act on. And that's what enabled them to have this balance, because at the same time that the company was highly data-driven, because of the challenge of raising X billions of dollars over decades in order to produce a product, you had to be at the same time a very compelling salesman. And you had to tell a story which investors would believe in. So ahead of the data. So I think you're right to identify this. You couldn't just tell the story and not deliver the data. You had to do both. But you also couldn't just deliver the story and not, you couldn't just deliver the data and not tell an entrancing story, because investors wouldn't even bother to listen to you. So again, that's another thing I think that makes Josh somewhat unique, is that he told a great story, terrific salesman, but also was driven by having real data upon which to base business decisions and scientific decisions. It's two things. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
So it sounds like you did a lot to learn a lot about what the researchers were doing in the labs and figure out their culture.
Mm-hmm.
But did you ever have the opportunity to see more of the business side, particularly the marketers or the salespeople, and what they were doing and what their culture was like?
Sure. Yeah. The first book, back when I was in Vertex between 1989 and 1993, you couldn't really call Vertex a drug company. It was a lab, essentially. They were starting to do business development and make deals but they didn't have a product to sell, and they weren't going to have a product to sell for a very long time, which is one of the reasons I wanted to go back in the second time. The second book is much more of a business book. I practically spent all my time with the marketers and the commercial people. And they too, I think, had a pretty consistent identification with the original goals of the company. Josh tells this story all the time. In fact, there's he was here last year, and on YouTube there's a video of his talk. If you're interested, you should go hear it. But in 1952, George Merck, who was the scion of this family-owned, what had been in the 30s and 40s, basically a fine chemical company, he turned Merck into a drug company and did that by putting a very high premium on research and development and, as he would put it, putting patients first. So in 1952, George Merck was on the cover of Time magazine, and it said, "Medicine is for people, not for profits." Now, Vertex wants to make a profit. Vertex wants to make a big profit. It wants to reward its investors. But I do think to a certain extent it has been able to keep some of that focus. What's really interesting about that George Merck quote, which Josh uses all the time and uses in the speech that he gave here last year, is that the second and third parts of that are, if we remember that medicine is for people and not for profits, the profits will follow. And the better that we remember that medicine is for people and not for profits, the better our profits will be. So within the pharmaceutical industry, and Vertex has spent 20+ years trying to prove this, there still exists the idea that if you can come up with a drug that is really meaningful, that transforms the lives of very sick people, you'll make plenty of money. You don't have to worry about the money. So don't put the money first. Put the money second. Put the people first. The money will follow. And Vertex's recent experience seems to bear that out. Now, again, I can't speak for the future. I don't know what they're going to be able to do over the next 10 years to consistently prove that this is true. But that was the original philosophy, and the marketing and salespeople got it as well as the scientists and the original founding group, I thought. Yes, sir.
I know that you said that it's difficult to translate scientific discovery into business, but I mean, why nowadays because of the technology boom and because of it's easy to find a lot of startups in the newspaper or in Wall Street Journal, but why is it so hard to find biotech startups today? Like why is it so hard for entrepreneurs to to come up with an idea with.
Well, I would say the simple answer for that is that over the last 30 plus years, I don't know, I'll just throw out a figure. Maybe $100 billion has been spent on pharmaceutical research and development. Maybe it's $200 billion. It's a lot of money. And it has produced not very much. A lot of really exciting, interesting ideas, but again, very tough stuff. You start to deal with the biological uncertainties of putting something in the human body, and all kinds of things can and do go wrong. So a lot of investors feel that they've been burned, that research and development is actually what they call a value destroyer, that it's, that's not the way to go, because if you invest in something that's very early stage, the possibility that we'll ever get to produce something of any real value is minuscule. So don't even bother. The ideas continue to be incredibly exciting, but the path is so long and the investment is so great and the track record is so poor that a lot of investors just think now it's not, that's a hell of a story, but I can't invest in that because I can't see the end, and chances are, based on what we know about how these things go, you're going to fail. So I think, there's constant churn and new ideas coming out of NIH, academic labs, the industry labs themselves, but the investor community is pretty gun-shy right now about putting money into something, that, especially at an early stage. So the ideas are there, but as I say, it's the chances of success are so small that it's pretty hard to track money at this point. Yes, sir.
I read that billion dollar molecule book and I found it very exciting. And so while reading the book, I realized there are two different cultures. One is the academic culture, one is the industry culture. In academic culture, there is an emphasis more on the recognition of publications, where industry is like more secrecy, confidentiality. So what do you think? Is it the difference between the cultures, or is it the difference or leaders' interest or ambitions that makes academia and industry go along?
Well, they have different goals. They serve different purposes. I think we need both, obviously. I think one of the things that got people at Vertex very annoyed about academic scientists is when their careers are based on publication. That is, and the more original work that they did and could publish and take credit for, the more they were going to advance. But that didn't necessarily help in trying to advance a drug to market. So, you see a lot of grandstanding there. You see a lot of, people who build careers on very speculative discoveries, but it's so much harder and takes so much longer and costs so much more to actually produce a drug that you need a different kind of culture. You can't, so they're very separate, but they do overlap and they need one another because, an interesting discovery of a new target protein, for instance, is nothing without the years of slog that follow that may or may not produce a drug.
Okay, I'm going to let, I forgot some of the students have classes.
Okay.
They've been slipping out.
Okay.
So, couple of last thing I'd mention is we do have a table set up. The Barnes & Noble people here at Bentley have set up a table with all the books we've been talking about tonight. I encourage everyone to buy them because that's how authors make a living. And also,
not
I think,
really,
unless they're Bentley professors.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
And Barry will be signing those for us also. But also we're going to get some food, get some drink, and then we found it very nice in a smaller setting to continue some of the themes that have come up today.
Sure.
The other thing I'll tell the students is check out our Center for Integration of Science and Industry. Bentley is a real leader in bringing a lot of this together. Many of your peers work in the center, do research on these things. At least check out the website, follow us on Twitter, and revisit some of the speakers we've had over the past year. Thank you both so much for this. Thank you.